ready to go ahead and get started. We've got an exciting program for this evening. But
Well, to begin with, thank you for coming. And more importantly, personally, thank you for being steelhead. It means a great deal to see people who are so interested in our fisheries and the future of the fisheries to have you still active and still trying to get things done. It's hard times, we've got hard roads ahead of us. Ain't nothing easy going on for the fish or for the future of our resources or anything that we can pass on to future generations. We all sit here in the room together and we can say, I can remember the good days, right? We've all been here when there wasn't a 5-crop bag limit. We've all been here when we could throw a worm on a hook and drift it down the stream. And now you can't even fish the streams, let alone put a worm on it. And for God's sakes, don't catch anything if it's got a barb. The political resources behind curtailing our futures and our activities are manifest. They're every place. They're coming at us from all directions. This reel, not really a reel, it's a winch. Has no gears, has no dog, no stop. It was simply to hold line. Vintage pre-1850 was found in a burnt out homestead farm on the Snake River Canyon over out of Richland, Oregon. And the fellow that found it about 20 years ago got it through to me. It's cast iron, a little bit of, I'm sure some local guy was, an anvil and a hammer, probably rebuilt the crank on the thing. So there's a lot of homemade Americana in it, but we know the age, we know the origin, and it would have only been used to store line. It wasn't a situation where you could crank the fish in. You lifted the fish up and cranked back line, or you hand lined the fish in and cranked it all back on. So a winch was only there to hold the line, but it's quite old. This little reel, Shakespeare Jr., little reel, still runs very nicely. Vintage 1910 by Shakespeare. The second or third model reels that they made. Really kind of neat. They're all made out of brass and the silver plating is gone. So it's old, but it's nice to have. This is a Nottingham reel made in England. English style reels in the early days, 1800s. These reels started making about 1850 till 1940, 1950 actually. They made them for 100 years. Were made out of wood. They have a clicker and a dog for a drag, kind of like a fly reel, but they're just small wooden reels that held line, generally brass side plates and clickers. This salmon mooching reel, vintage, probably 1920, 1930, is homemade. And I can't tell you who made it, can't tell you why, anything about it. We know what the age is because of the materials that were used, but it was somebody who was doing basically salmon trolling, and they wanted a reel like that. He would have had to wrap the line around the crank or put it on a stop on the boat, so he got a strike, unwrapped it, and he could strike the fish one way or the other. Alcedo, how many of you are familiar with that word? Alcedo spinning reels. Gentlemen in the back. They were considered in the 1950s and early 60s to be the finest spinning reel in the world. These little jewels are still highly sought after, very, very intricate, made in Italy. They sold in the 50s and 60s for $100 new in those days. So, and they're still worth at least $100 or more. In the leather bag with the extra spool, you don't find them often. This is an A.J. Cox. Now, Cox made a very fine casting reel with a free spool, reversed the crank on them in the late 40s after World War II. So you could reverse the crank, throws it into a free spool cast, pick up the crank, re-engage it for forward level wide. Prior to that, this was what they made in the 1920s and the mid-30s. German nickel steel, very nice craftsmanship in them, very pretty little reels. Scarce, they made a model 15, 30, 60, and 90 in the series. So there's 4 models out there for collection. See those? This is kind of an interesting little item here. The Marathon Lure Company in the 50s after World War II decided that they would manufacture a Christmas present gift pack. So they made it to look like a book, and it would sit on your shelf in your office, and it said Business Forecast by Marathon 1960. And if it was sitting there with a bunch of others, you would think that that's what it was. Actually, it was a gift pack, and you could order them sent to your friends around the country. And this particular one, I had 5 of them. They were ordered by the Gresham Berry Growers Co-ops, and they sent them to all the farmers that were bringing in produce to the co-op. So each year the farmer would get one of these, 1960, 51, so on. And it'd have a different set of equipment in it. Not many of them got really sent out there. Not many of them survived. Not many of them survived in the original boxes with the original mailing, dates, everything else. It's kind of neat to find something that's totally intact with all of the information still on it. You can look at those. Here's Four Brothers, which is a subsidiary of Pfluger. Pfluger's originally was called the Empire Tackle Manufacturing Company, 1880 something. Then it became Pfluger in about 1910-ish. And Four Brothers was a competing company. Pfluger bought them, continued with their label, and Pfluger bought out a lot of other product labels. But there's a June bug spinner on the original card, vintage, probably 1915, give or take, something like that. And the Krauser, now there's 3 reels here. This is a Pfluger Buckeye, vintage 1920 casting reel. Been refurbished by my friend Art back there. And it still cranks pretty good for a casting reel that's 90 years old. This is a Pfluger Bond, which would have been a standard salmon reel in the knuckle buster days before they put star drags on things. And as you can see, the machining on this is still about as good as you're going to want to find on anything that's still cranking. And in the box, it would be vintage 1950 something, is an Ohio, which is a saltwater style star drag. You need to tighten that crank down a little bit. And they're good casting reels. You could still be salmon fishing with this today without any problems. Now, the deal for tonight was you people were going to bring things. I'd take a look at it, give you some idea of the age and the approximate value, and I'll start around the room. And that's an ambassador.
2600.
Yep.
But look at the shape that they did.
No, these little reels were, and they're still highly sought after.
I got the string
That's
on
our
my foot.
But the free spool, they made this in a 15, an 18, a 2000, 5 or 6 different models of this narrow frame, plastic bolster, some with star drag, some without. This is the best one.
What year would that be from?
Well, they continued to make these up until the late 1980s.
Well, they did.
They made this series from basically late 60s through, say, 85, 88.
Sweet.
And surprisingly enough, they're quite expensive.
I bought that from a gentleman in Gage, Oregon when I first moved up in the canyon in '70.
Yeah.
And I said, of course you got the box? He said, no, that's the first thing I throw away.
Yes, and the box would be, this reel without the box is,
Nothing.
no, God, no. This reel without the box is someplace between $100 and $200.
Ain't that right?
With the box, it would have been worth another 100. In the box with the papers, $300 to $350 on a good day.
Yeah, I'm still looking for the box.
Okay.
Similar to that, 5,000, then.
Ambassador 5,000, 3-screw.
It's real common, but I thought that one was in real good shape.
Well, actually, it's not common. They make them, the screws here, the take-down screws, take apart.
Yeah.
They make a 3-screw and a 4-screw. And the 4 screws are common, the 3 screws are early. So it's also, I don't know what you value it at, but in today's market, that would fetch you beyond $100.
I turned down 300 for each one of them because
Well,
I want to keep them.
This, 300 on this would be high, and it would be really high on these. I can, today's world on the internet, on eBay, these reels are going for, depending on condition, and this is in very nice condition, someplace between 80 and 125. So,
And didn't this one come in a leather case?
yes, just like
Yeah.
that reel up there.
And I don't have any of them in.
So did this section.
Yeah. Old Jim Elstad won't sell me any leather cases. That's an old Hendrix. What year is that?
Hendrix was a company started in the 1880s, and they manufactured simple, inexpensive little line holding reels. This reel actually sold for, in the 1880s, for about 20 cents.
Is that right?
They continued to manufacture these without change. They're called raised pillars because of the side plates here. They continued to manufacture these into the 1920s and 30s without a great change in price. The reel probably never, ever sold for more than 39 cents.
Is that right? I just thought it was so unique.
No, they're great little reels, and in today's world, they carry, there's lots of them out there, so
Yeah.
they're not expensive. But if you can find them in the $15 to $25 range, and they're functional, it's worth hanging on to. They're just fun. They're more fun to have than the Sunmark.
Yeah.
And this is, again, a stamped reel. The same basic premise is it's a side plate raised pillar, and the cross pins are all basically stampings, which is how this was manufactured also. Not expensive reel, sold in the mid-20s till World War II, under $1.
Yeah. Wooden handle kind of jolly on that.
Yeah, cheap paint, no undercoat.
Yeah, that's right.
And his rotting reel here is 1960s reel. What made it interesting is the fact that it's a direct drive, in as much as the crank drives the level line, cross line, as opposed to driving the gear shaft on the spool. So the gear that's driving this is connected and makes the crank or the spool go around, as opposed to these reels that are connected to the drive shaft and the spool, and a small gear makes this go back. So the gearing is the reverse of what's here. This was probably the first successful Japanese company that invaded America, was the Roddy Company out of San Francisco. And I remember selling a cajillion of them.
Yeah.
Ocean City 300, late 50s, early 60s, actually early 50s through the mid 1960s. Good spinning reel, very functional. Had one problem, cast aluminum frame and housing. You don't want to drop them. Then you have a two-piece reel that doesn't work, because they would generally shear right there. They were not very strong.
And the 310 is the left-hand crank, the 311 is the right-hand crank.
Yeah.
I have two of these and one right-hand crank.
And you could convert.
Yeah, this one can be converted, I see now.
This also was a reel that didn't really get off the ground. Pretty good. Martin, the crank is stamped as opposed to cast. I believe this to be late 50s through 1970. Martin's more famous for their fly reels than spinning reels. And this is the jewel of your collection. I have seen one other of these in my mine doesn't. I can't get my cap to rotate properly. Very unusual reel from upstate New York, unusual design.
I've never seen it.
Elisa, I believe is the name. And I'm serious, I haven't seen but one other, and this is it. So I'm congratulating you on that.
What kind of value would you place on that?
I see them occasionally, maybe every couple of 3 years, you'll see one on eBay, and they're generally in the 200 plus range. So it's a very scarce spinning,
Yeah.
and that's about all I can tell you.
Well, I've got about 3,500 reels and I keep most of them locked up.
That's called a lot of work. The first one is a Wright McGill rod, has a neat story behind it. In World War II, all of these products came on the market that were surplus. This is a solid glass, fiberglass rod, made by Wright McGill, about 1948. And again, 1958, I'll take it back. They took, Wright McGill found a ton of surplus Army tank fiberglass antennas. That's what this rod is. Now, they were square, and this is a square rod. So to get the taper from it, Wright McGill devised a series of machines that polished, brushed, burned, ground, tapered, however they did it, the rod so that it would have some flex. And they put a finish on it and sold it for $9.95. They sold a ton of them. And I know because I sold a ton of them. Now, the bad part of the story is that after you use the rod for a year or 2 or 3, many cases, the finish wore off, or didn't last or didn't keep. And when you flex this like a piece of wood that's got grains running parallel, this grain stops and this one continues to go. And if it flexed, it pulled away from the single string that was sticking out. Consequently, it started up here as a small splitter, and down here was a pretty big chunk of rod as it progressed down the taper. So the rods had to be replaced. Wright McGill didn't like replacing rods, so they discontinued the manufacture after 3 years. They made the salmon steelhead rod, which is here. They made a trout rod, they made a casting rod, made a fly rod. All of them sold for $9.95 in 2 colors, white and green. So they're kind of neat, but they all were antenna blanks to begin with. This Whirlaway, again, vintage late, 1950s, early 60s, Great Lakes manufacturing back in the Midwest made this rod and reel combination. And its claim to fame, and it's really a pretty good rod, was you would reverse the crank on the handle, put your thumb here to stop the line, cast, let go with the thumb, line came off of the spinning reel spool just like a regular spinning reel. Then you'd go ahead and crank, get your line in or fish, whatever. The bad part, they're really pretty good reels. Until you got to snag a line inside. Now you had to disassemble the whole damn thing to get in, to take the kink in the line out. And in those days, monofilament was much smarter than it is today. In those days, monofilament had a memory. And it said, I used to be like this. And you would cast it, and it said, I still want to be like this. So it would go back and kink up and coil, and they'd all end up inside. You'd have to take it apart, repair it, which made it not much fun to fish with. About that time, you'd say, oh, that goddamn thing is cranked up again. Boom. You throw it on the ground. This butt cap hits the ground or the rock, breaks the housing. The whole thing is now garbage. They made it in 3 nice colors and 2 models. This is the standard model. They made it in black, gray, brown, maybe a maroon. And the expensive model had a dragnet back here. And again, the instant you said, it was over. So finding survivors is kind of tough. It's nice to see one.